This has long been one of, if not my genuinely favorite story about the awfulness of humanity. It has it all, everything that makes us who we are at our core, plus the crushing serendipitous fate of simply being in the wrong place at the very most wrongest time. The atomic bombings are the most terrifying historical event that our species has passed through, and some of us got way closer than others. Like Tsutomu Yamaguchi, who's the only recognized double bomb survivor from the nuclear blast that put a sudden and jarring end to World War II. But the details of his run-in with nuclear warfare are going to make you want to simultaneously laugh and cry. You're going to want to stick around for this story. On August 6, 1945, 29-year-old Tsutomu Yamaguchi was just finishing up a 3-month-long business trip in Hiroshima, Japan. Yamaguchi worked for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, which is a company with a long history tracing back to the introduction of naval technology to the Tokugawa shogunate from the Dutch. Then during World War II, the company was responsible for making heavy machinery and large equipment and engineering projects like ships, planes, and trains. Yamaguchi was a draftsman who designed oil tankers, and he was in Hiroshima for that long 3-month stay working on designs for a brand new one. And then on the morning of the 6th, he was walking to the train station with colleagues because the work was done and his trip was at an end. Yamaguchi realized suddenly that he'd forgotten his ID back at the Mitsubishi plant, so he turned around and told his colleagues that he'd catch up with them there. It was around 8:15 when he heard the roaring engines of the Enola Gay careening toward the city center. He looked up just in time to see the B-29 bomber drop a small object attached to parachutes. Of course, now we know that this object was the first ever atomic bomb to have been used in a live conflict scenario, a bomb codenamed Little Boy. Now, this was the biggest war that anyone had ever seen, and Yamaguchi was an engineer. He was in the midst of all this, and he knew what to expect, or at least he thought he did. It was one bomb dropped on the city center, and there was really no reason to worry so much about that, except that he barely had enough time to dive into a drainage ditch to avoid the shockwave, after what he described as, quote, the lightning of a huge magnesium flare, which took up the visible sky in front of him. And even though he was smart enough and fast enough to take cover, the subsequent shockwave picked him up anyway and twirled him around and dumped him into a nearby field. Blast ruptured his eardrums, made him temporarily blind, and caused severe burns on a significant portion of his upper body. All of this even though he was 1.9 miles from the epicenter of the blast. Eventually, Yamaguchi managed to crawl along to relative safety, making his way to an air raid shelter, and once there, he met up with the colleagues he was planning to leave with, and they all spent a restless night together. The next day, the trio made it to the train station, which was somehow still functioning, and they took the long overnight trip home to the city where they lived, Nagasaki. If you know, you know. When Yamaguchi walked in the door of his home, his family didn't recognize him because he was so badly burned. Of course, everyone immediately made him go to the doctor because, atomic blast. And, he's a man, so why would he go to the doctor even if he's been in an atomic blast? The doctor was a childhood friend who also couldn't recognize him because of all his burns, and then he wrapped Yamaguchi in so many bandages that when he got home again, his mother said he looked like a ghost. And then in maybe the absolute worst example of toxic work culture that there's ever been, despite living through an unprecedented mass death event caused by the most terrifying and devastating weapon of war ever seen by human eyes, Yamaguchi showed up to work the next day. Listen, Yamaguchi, you gotta be a team player, think of the shareholders. He was a good salary man, and of course Japan is notorious for its completely non-existent work-life balance, so much so that the government recently has launched initiatives to try to deal with that. So Yamaguchi goes into the Mitsubishi office on the morning of August 9th and reports on the 3-month business trip. And oh, by the way, a massive explosion destroyed the entire city of Hiroshima while I was there. But nobody will believe him about this. At around 11 in the morning, he's in a meeting with a supervisor trying desperately to convince the man that what he's saying is true, but it's not working. His supervisor is telling him that he's crazy, like there's something seriously wrong with him. Yamaguchi comes to work all burned up and wrapped in bandages like a mummy, spouting nonsense about one single bomb annihilating a city? That's just nuts. You're mistaken, Yamaguchi. maybe you saw something, but you got it wrong somehow. And there were just a bunch of other bombs you just didn't see because there's no way a single bomb could do all this. And there's no thanks or reward for his loyalty after coming into work right after surviving a nuclear explosion, because no one can wrap their heads around the fact that this really even happened. And that's exactly when it happens again. This was the moment the B-29 bomber boxcar dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki. Yamaguchi was standing with his boss next to the floor-to-ceiling windows in the meeting room, pleading with him about the blast and trying very hard to get the man to believe him, when the pair watched the sky light up once again. Yamaguchi would later describe the terrifying thought he'd had that the bomb had followed him home from Hiroshima. But unfortunately, he knew exactly what was about to happen, so he dove to the floor and somehow got his boss to do the same as the mushroom cloud grew into the heavens. The shockwave shattered the windows all around them as the pair cowered on the floor. Take that, middle management. You gotta believe your employees next time. Incredibly, Yamaguchi survived his second atomic bomb blast, this time pretty much unscathed, or no more scathed than he already had been from Hiroshima. But what is mind-bogglingly bananas about this was that he was once again exactly 1.9 miles away from the epicenter of the blast. Yamaguchi doesn't wait to say, "I told you so." He gets himself out of there and rushes home to make sure his family is all right, only to find his house partially collapsed. He starts rummaging around in the rubble looking for any sign of his family, and amazingly, in another case of bizarre serendipity, they survived too, but only because at the time of the explosion, they'd been so thoughtful as to go out and shop for burn cream for Yamaguchi. So they weren't home, and the only reason they survived the nuclear blast of Nagasaki was because Yamaguchi had been terribly burned in the blast at Hiroshima. If he hadn't survived the first bomb, they wouldn't have been out of the house, and they would have died in this one. This is kind of like a Donnie Darko moment.
Destruction is a form of creation.
The other crazy thing is that Yamaguchi lived a very long life after all this. He died in 2010 at the ripe old age of 93. It was stomach cancer that finally took him, and it likely had something to do with the radiation exposure. We know that he struggled with health problems throughout his life, and one of his children would go on the record to say that he was wrapped up in bandages for so much of their young lives that they didn't always know what he looked like. And the rest of his family also struggled with health problems, and his wife and son also died of cancer. Even though there are an estimated 165 or so people who survived both atomic bomb blasts, which is incredible on its own, because we're talking about an event that killed about 220,000 people and completely destroyed 2 cities, Yamaguchi is the only one officially recognized by the Japanese government as a 2-time survivor, or what's called Niju Hibakusha. Hibakusha is a term that roughly translates to bomb-affected person, and there are somewhere around 650,000 officially recognized Hibakusha. Yamaguchi stayed out of the spotlight for a long time, but as he grew older, he discovered a sense of personal responsibility to speak out against the horrors of nuclear proliferation and atomic warfare. He began engaging in advocacy work and giving speeches in support of nuclear disarmament, one of which would come at the official recognition of his status as a double bomb survivor. He generated a lot of press at that moment, and he used it cleverly to talk about the atrocities that he witnessed and to continue to push for peace and sensibility in the face of a growing apocalyptic threat. At one point, Yamaguchi would say that, quote, "My double radiation exposure is now an official government record. It can tell the younger generation the horrifying history of the atomic bombings even after I die." He also once told an interviewer that, quote, "The reason I hate the atomic bomb is because of what it does to the dignity of human beings. And I honestly can't think of a more haunting sentiment than that." Yamaguchi's personal outlet for the trauma that haunted him was poetry, specifically a type of poetry called tanka, which he'd been writing for most of his life. You can actually watch a video of Yamaguchi reciting his poetry that's been uploaded to YouTube by a history professor, and I'll link that below in the didgeridoo. Even if you don't totally understand what he's saying, it's a bit challenging to watch because of the visible pain that comes through. Historian Chad Deal from the University of Virginia actually lived with Yamaguchi for a period in his later years, and in 2010, he self-published an English translation of Yamaguchi's poetry. It's titled horrifyingly, "And the river flowed as a raft of corpses." I'm gonna let that be a personal call for you about whether or not you'd like to check that out. It's on my list, but that says a lot about who I am. And just like the next video is also on my list, so please make sure to like and subscribe so that I can keep bringing you more of these. Links to the episode sources along with my Patreon and website are down in the didgeridoodles. Consider making a donation to the cause because I am a poor kid and would like to be financially stable someday. Like to tell my parents they could maybe start being proud of me. Is it too much to ask? Until that day comes, let's do some good about terrifying weapons of war, nuclear disarmament, and the incredibly challenging lessons from the past that just will not leave us alone. And I won't leave you alone either. I'll see you in the next one.